We're all for celebrating glory and giving props where due, but let's take a step away from positivity and happiness and focus purely on the disappointment and deep feelings of anguish that came from the worst performances from each of the UFC's reigning champions. Okay, I'm definitely overselling the dreariness of the video. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. Let's get into it. Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza. To kick things off, we're first going to take a look at the UFC strawweight champion Rose Namajunas, a fighter who has been forced to prove her doubters wrong on several occasions, walking a path that eventually led to her becoming the first fighter in women's MMA history to successfully recapture a title that she had lost. And though I did feel as though her catastrophic Kimura attempt that eventually saw her slam KO'd against Jessica Andrade was worth a mention, I do also think that Carla Esparza did the single best job at handling Thug Rose out of all of her opponents so far. Fighting for the inaugural 115-pound title, Esparza capitalized on her opponent's lack of experience and thoroughly dominated her before finding the third-round submission for the tap. Nowadays, all signs do point to an eventual rematch between these two after Carla found some incredible late career form, but if you're looking for some insight into how well Esparza can do with that style matchup, as different as Rose is now, be sure to check that one out. Valentina Shevchenko versus Amanda Nunes 1. Indeed, Shevchenko came on strong late, but even if it wasn't the type of drubbing that Amanda Nunes usually gives out, I still think that the Lioness had more success against Valentina than anyone else to have crossed paths with her in the UFC so far. Like most of you, both of their fights left me wanting more, equally in terms of the all-out action that was promised, and also for the simple fact that these two are the best of the best in women's MMA right now. Sure, Nunes has gone 2-0 over the bullet, but even still, I do think that it's safe to say that they have unresolved business. The sport needs to see Nunes versus Shevchenko 3. I can't put it any simpler than that. Amanda Nunes versus Kat Zingano. For the two-weight world champion Amanda Nunes, when it comes to poor performances inside the UFC octagon of late, the pickings have definitely been slim. And even though a very early career loss by way of armbar could have gotten the nod, I still think that the most relevant disappointment in Nunes' overall professional run came when she was TKO'd in brutal fashion by Kat Zingano in 2014. One of the major criticisms that followed the Lioness through the earlier stages of her career was her tendency to slow down as the fight wore on, how she was generally prone to losing some of her explosive energy after a fast start. And in taking on the fan favourite Zingano, a good opening round gave way to some easy takedowns scored by her opponent as the fight wore on. By the middle period, Nunes was on the receiving end of some serious ground and pound, and though you wouldn't believe it based on the formidable aura she carries with her today, she was violently pounded out for the finish in the third. Brandon Moreno versus Alexander Pantoja. It's crazy to think just how far Brandon Moreno has come since he was originally declared as the lowest seed athlete in that season of The Ultimate Fighter that introduced him to a lot of us. From there, some stuttering form saw him eventually get the boot from the promotion, as Dana and the UFC looked set to axe the flyweight division entirely. However, Moreno's form made him undeniable, and he would later recapture his spot on the UFC roster. What's interesting here is that between his professional record and his stint in exhibition matchups in TUF, Moreno has actually lost twice to the flyweight contender Alexander Pantoja, getting submitted in The Ultimate Fighter before a pretty comprehensive unanimous decision loss in the UFC. And of the two, I think Moreno definitely showed less in the UFC bout, their second clash. I also think it was a more impressive victory for Pantoja because of the version of Moreno that came to fight. In the end, he just couldn't get anything going, but with the Brazilian now hanging around the top 3 at 125 pounds, I would be willing to bet that we'll see a third matchup before too long. Aljamain Sterling versus Marlon Moraes. Aljamain Sterling might not have convinced anyone of his merits as champion, but don't make the mistake of discounting his hugely impressive run within the UFC up until this point. And though his pair of back-to-back split decision losses showcased a fighter who really needed to find an extra gear, and in particular that Brian Caraway fight that probably could have gone his way, Aljo's vicious KO loss to Marlon Moraes definitely gets my nod. That was just about as bad a night at the office as you could ever hope for. A 67-second knee to the face knockout that left the Funkmaster stiffened out. Brutal simply ain't the word. Alexander Volkanovski versus Corey Nelson. Out of all of the disappointing performances we're going to feature here, I don't think anyone will get as much credit for their efforts as the featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski. Sure, he got head kicked and finished in the third round of his clash against Corey Nelson, but at the time, Volk was actually fighting at 170 pounds, going 4-1 in the division before deciding that maybe lightweight would be his optimum weight class, something he would only figure out for sure when he once again stepped down to featherweight. Like some of the other newer newer figures on this list, finding bad spots in Volkanovski's resume wasn't easy. But this TKO defeat, the most recent loss of his career, still stood as a pretty rough outing for this future champion. It's just crazy to think that he would have to drop 2 weight classes in order to reach his potential. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content and would like to keep up to date with all of our weekly uploads, be sure to subscribe to the channel before leaving a like and a comment to keep YouTube's algorithms fully aware of the fact that we are fast becoming the leanest, meanest, most hard-nosed MMA channel on the platform. Also, we recently set up a Patreon account, so if you want to help support the channel, the option is now there to subscribe and unlock some exclusive content and opportunities to engage. Charles Oliveira versus Donald Cerrone. Indeed, the Paul Felder knockout was a real kick in the teeth, or elbow in the face depending on how you want to look at it, as the Irish Dragon managed to knock out Charles Oliveira from his guard. And sure, the numerous submissions that have forced the tap out of Dubronx over the years makes his status as the most deadly submission artist in the sport that bit odder, but for my money, his worst defeat came when he was completely outgunned by Donald Cerrone back in 2011. Just 21 years old at the time, Charles was still known for his deadly submissions, but of the two, Cowboy was the one who was on the fast track to lightweight title contention, and after making the power difference between them known, Cerrone eventually dropped his man, before moving in to relentlessly ground and pound his way to the finish. The fight would stand as a majorly disappointing moment for Oliveira, and the defeat that eventually pushed him towards a long stint at featherweight. Kamaru Usman versus Jose Caceres. The UFC welterweight champion Kamaru Usman hasn't really had too much in the way of bad nights out since debuting in the UFC. Sure, that 30% victory over Emil Mech wasn't thrilling, but like a lot of wins during that time, it was still dominant. You actually have to go all the way back to Usman's second professional fight to find a real dud, and even still, it was pretty understandable. A strong showing in his debut gave way to a big step up in competition, with the grappling novice that was the Nigerian Nightmare taking on the submission-savvy Jose Caceres. Just under 4 minutes in, Usman's shortcomings in the BJJ department cost him dearly, as the fight-ending rear-naked choke ended his night there and then. Obviously, this lit a fire underneath him to become a more well-rounded fighter, eventually earning his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt under Jorge Santiago, and of course, he would go on to never lose another fight up until the point that this video was made. Israel Adesanya versus Jan Blachowicz. Given that Israel Adesanya has only encountered one career setback in the form of his light heavyweight loss to Jan Blachowicz, it does make this pick a little easier. Obviously, some people weren't thrilled by his conservative approach to outpointing Yoel Romero to defend his title, but even still, he managed to deal with a very real threat in a manner that saw him escape relatively unscathed, and he actually won the fight, which does count for something. So yeah, the loss to Blachowicz was by no means a devastating one, but it was definitely more consistently impressive for Jan than the UFC commentary team would have led you to believe on the night itself. Joe Rogan, I'm looking at you. But with him physically outmatched and some takedown defense and bottom game issues brought under the magnifying glass, Adesanya was handed his first professional MMA defeat, and for my money, it was a night that brought out some of his most underwhelming work. Glover Teixeira versus Anthony Johnson. The shocking and hugely inspirational late career surge of Glover Teixeira has been made what it is through his setbacks, through those moments that we thought could have been the start of his downfall. And though his losses to John Jones and Alexander Gustafsson in particular were pretty tough pills to swallow, getting knocked out cold in 13 seconds on the main card of the McGregor-Diaz rematch is in another league entirely as far as disasters are concerned. Indeed, it was more Rumble being Rumble than Teixeira being purely at fault, but make no mistake, this was a pretty bad one. Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. And finally, we come to the worst performance in the career of Francis Ngannou. And no, the Stipe fight was not the worst one. It was definitely a rude awakening and an embarrassing reality check after all that promotional machine hype. But let's be real, the Derek Lewis loss was as bad an attempt at a rebound as you're ever likely to see. A fight so bad that it brought levels of doubt into our minds that even after the 4 extremely fast knockouts that followed, a lot of fans were still unsure about Ngannou. I don't even want to talk about the fight. And look, I never find MMA boring when I'm watching it live, for the most part. The idea that something could happen at any moment is usually enough to keep me interested, but this one was pretty awful. But who do you think had the single worst performance of the lot? And do you agree with our picks? Do let us know your opinions in the comments section below. We always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. And if you fancy getting involved through Patreon, you'll find the link in the description. Thank you for watching.